The first time the snow tried to take her, it wasn't even deep. It was early November, not yet the white wall of January that could blot out a man's shadow and leave his bones in a standing position come spring. No, that first time, the snow barely kissed her boots, but the baby was sick and the boy wouldn't stop coughing, and the creek water had frozen in the buckets overnight. She had woken up to silence, no birds, no wind, no movement, just that kind of stillness that only happened up this high, in a narrow pocket between the ridges where the sun barely reached in winter, and every sound got swallowed by the trees. Edith Marlowe had not chosen this life, not at first. She'd been brought here by a man who swore he could read the mountains like a preacher read scripture. He'd said they'd be rich in a year, trapping furs, trading, maybe even striking gold if they went deep enough along the southern slopes. He'd said all kinds of things. He always had a way of making the impossible sound like a matter of faith. And she, only 23 then, with 2 toddlers and a third already swelling in her belly, had believed him. But he'd died in the 2nd year, dysentery or starvation, or maybe just foolishness and frostbite. He'd gone up into the cliffs looking for a shortcut to the valley and never came back. She found what was left of him come April, his coat shredded and one boot missing, wedged under a boulder like he'd tried to crawl inside the rock to stay warm. And that had been the start of her real life, the start of the long 20. She buried him without tears. No time for them. The winter hadn't ended just because the calendar said it should. Snow was still waist-high in the shadows. The youngest child had nearly died from croup the week before, and her hands were cracked to the knuckles from chopping wood and hauling water and digging traps with a dull blade. But she survived, she and the children, and that was the first miracle people would later talk about, though they'd never see it as such. They'd say she was lucky, or she must have had help. They'd whisper that maybe some old Indian taught her tricks, or that she'd found some hidden cave with geothermal heat. They'd say anything but the truth, that she just refused to die. The 2nd year, the roof collapsed under snowpack. She rebuilt it with pine logs and river clay, her own hands pulling more splinters than nails. She packed the walls with moss and animal fur, and taught her eldest boy, now only 5, how to whittle kindling so fine it would catch with just one spark. He didn't speak much, not anymore, not since his father disappeared, but he watched everything. By the 4th winter, the middle child, a girl named Ruth, had learned how to tan hides well enough to sew mittens. They weren't pretty, they stank sometimes, but they kept fingers from turning black. Edith taught her children to make glue from pine sap and ash, taught them to boil bones for broth, taught them to listen to wind changes and track the direction of elk hooves by looking at scat freshness and pine needle disturbances. They had no calendar, only the hunger, and when the hunger came hard, and it always did, she would sometimes look at the children in the firelight and see bones where cheeks should have been, see how the eyes sank and the color drained. She kept a journal in her head, marking what days they found a rabbit, what days the traps came up empty, what days they survived, what days they only almost didn't. She never let them cry, not because she didn't believe in tears, but because tears froze, literally froze. The cold could turn a sob into a frostbite trail down a cheek, so she taught them to breathe slow and chew pine needles to keep from coughing blood, and how to listen to the forest when the silence got too loud. There were wolves, yes, and bears, but it wasn't those that nearly ended them. It was a fever in the 6th year. Ruth shook for 3 nights, eyes rolling, teeth chattering. Edith burned through every scrap of herb she had left from the summer forage. She boiled spruce tips, used rabbit dung tea, even chewed bark and spat it into the girl's mouth, praying the bitter would drive out the heat. It worked, but Ruth's hair fell out that winter, and her hearing never came back quite right. By the 9th year, they'd stopped remembering what bread tasted like, what a window was, what a bell sounded like. They no longer said, "when we go back," because there was no back to go to. There was only forward, day by day, mile by mile. Sometimes Edith thought about the road they came up all those years ago, thought about whether it had overgrown, swallowed up by thickets and mudslides and washed out bridges. She wondered if the little town down in the valley still remembered her name, wondered if any of them had guessed what happened when her husband stopped showing up with pelts and barter goods. Probably figured they moved on, died, or joined some outlaw band. They didn't know the truth, that somewhere above them, for 20 winters, a woman raised her children by hand. She made a snow stove from granite and mud, building it low and wide so it wouldn't tip in the wind or ice. Taught her boys how to stack wood inside it so smoke didn't give away their location to any drifters. She carved spoons from elk horn and ground acorns into a paste so bitter even the squirrels didn't try to steal it. And when one boy turned 15, he tried to leave, said he could make it down to the towns and come back with flour and boots. Edith didn't scream, didn't beg, just packed him a satchel and sewed a tiny pouch of her hair into the lining. He never came back. She didn't blame him, didn't hate him, but for days after she sat at the tree line at dawn, looking for footprints. None ever appeared. It was in the 13th year when the next danger came. Not snow, not hunger, not sickness, but men, trappers, or thieves, or worse. She didn't ask. She saw them first, through a break in the trees. 3 men on horses, the kind that didn't ride casual. They scanned the ridgelines too carefully, laughed too loud, like they were trying to flush something out. One had a rifle, polished. Another had pelts lashed to his saddle that weren't dried right. Amateurs. She had 10 minutes, maybe 12. She dug a shallow pit near the smoke stove and buried the children in it, covering them with a tarp sewn from deer hide and snow-laced pine boughs, told them not to breathe, not even blink. Then she waited, alone. When the men came, she stood in the open, a hatchet in one hand, the other hand smeared with soot and ash. She pretended to be mad, raving, made her voice crack and babble, said spirits lived here, said her husband would come soon, and he'd have the devil in his rifle. They laughed, but something in her eyes must have made them unsure. She'd learned long ago that madness, real or feigned, was more dangerous than strength. Men feared crazy more than courage, because courage could be broken. Madness could not. They left, not quick, not scared, but unsettled. And Edith waited an entire day before unburying her children, fingers trembling not from cold, but the weight of pretending not to feel anything. She hadn't cried in 10 years, not since her husband died. But that night she sat outside the shelter, wrapped in furs, eyes wide at the stars, and let it happen, silent, no sound, just tears sliding down skin like tiny betrayals. Then came year 15, then 16. The children grew tall. Gaunt, yes, but tall. Her youngest could skin a squirrel with his eyes closed. Ruth could mimic a bird call so well it fooled hawks. They were creatures of the forest now, no longer soft, no longer townsfolk. But something was changing in Edith. Not weakness, not regret, just a question. How long was survival still survival, and not simply hiding from the world? The wind that morning came from the east, strange and biting. It slithered through the pines with a dry hiss, not the usual damp groan of mountain wind, and for a long while Edith sat on the flat rock near the ridge, listening to it like a woman listens to distant voices she isn't sure are real. It had been nearly 17 years now, maybe longer. She hadn't kept count after the first decade. The notches on the wall meant less as her children stopped needing birthdays and started needing only calories and warmth. She watched the sun creep through the trees like it too, wasn't sure it belonged here. The children were still asleep inside the shelter, curled under a patchwork of old hide and stitched burlap she'd made from old flour sacks traded long ago, back when she still believed someone might return to the trail. 17 years. And in that time, the world had changed. Below, at least. She didn't know how, but she felt it. There were fewer birds. The sky looked less blue. Something was different. And now her own bones groaned when she crouched too low. Her joints whispered to her in the morning like quiet accusations. Still she kept working. Still she kept chopping wood with her dull hatchet, sharpening it by lantern light with a stone that had been worn nearly smooth. The boy, well, man now, was outside when she returned. Abram, he had his father's shoulders but her silence. He rarely said much unless it was necessary. Even as a child, he'd understood how silence could be its own kind of defense. That day, he was gathering pine cones, not for fire, but for boiling. You could make a bitter tea from them, good for scurvy. Not that they had any fresh meat to go with it, but it kept the gums from bleeding. Something wrong with the wind, Edith said quietly as she passed him. He nodded but didn't look up. I know. And that was all they said about it. Later they would find the tracks. Not animal, human, boot prints, fresh, deep. It had been 4 years since the last stranger. 4 years of peace and quiet and routine. 4 years where the children had grown stronger and quieter, and more adapted than ever before. But the tracks shattered that. Edith crouched near them with her rifle, the last good one, single shot, cleaned every week with a strip of shirt she'd once worn in town. She measured the print with her hand, not too big, not too small, no drag marks, not limping, probably alone. But men rarely traveled alone in the mountains unless they were running from something or chasing something worse. She followed the trail upstream for a while, staying low, keeping her breath behind her teeth. Every sound was treachery now. The ice snapped beneath her with each step like tiny warning bells. Then she saw it. Smoke, thin, controlled, a tent, pitched under a low outcropping. Whoever it was, they'd built smart. They were careful, and that meant they weren't lost, which meant they were looking. Edith crept back to the shelter by dusk. Ruth was waiting, a knife on her hip, eyes sharper than any point she carried. She didn't ask what Edith had seen. She just said, I'll pack the stove. That was the protocol. If danger came close, you disassembled the smoke stove, scattered the coals, buried the bones, rolled up the hides. They'd done it a dozen times. Practice. For this. That night the shelter looked like a natural heap of branches and debris again, just as it had during the year of the fever. No light, no sound. They all slept in shifts, the children taking the first watch while Edith rested with the rifle in her arms and the knife in her boot. She dreamed of bells. She hadn't heard a bell in nearly 2 decades, but in the dream, one rang over and over, echoing through pine and snow and silence until it sounded like thunder. When she awoke, the air was still, and the forest smelled like something new, smoke, but not theirs. They weren't alone anymore. It was midday when the stranger found their trail. He didn't try to be quiet about it either. He called out, "Hello, anyone here?" His voice was too loud, too confident, the kind of voice that expected a reply. Edith watched from the trees, rifle cradled in her lap. He wore a long brown coat and a wool cap, face half covered in beard and frost. But he wasn't gaunt. He didn't walk like he was starving. In fact, he looked well-fed, boots in good shape, rifle clean. He was no trapper. She made no move. Not yet. "I'm not here to hurt anyone," he called again, stepping closer. "Looking for a woman. Been gone a long time. Her name's Edith Marlowe." She stopped breathing. The trees did too. The man waited. No answer came. "I'm her nephew," he said louder. "Name's Jacob, from Willow Creek. My pa was Samuel Marlowe, her brother." Ruth touched Edith's arm gently. The girl was 17 now, but her eyes were older than most grandmothers. She whispered, "Is that real?" Edith didn't speak. Couldn't. The name unlocked a box she'd kept buried deeper than any snow cave. Samuel, her brother. He would have been in his 50s now. The last time she saw him was when the baby was born, right before they left, before the trail, before it all went wrong. Jacob waited another full minute. Then he sighed, turned, and left a bundle on the ground before walking back the way he came. When he was gone, Edith waited. 2 hours. Then she crept to the bundle. Inside was a thick wool blanket, 2 tins of coffee, and a letter, written in shaky hand, dated a year ago. The words burned. "Dearest Edith, if you're reading this, someone found you. I don't know if you're alive, but I couldn't die without trying one last time. Your husband never came back. They sent searchers, but no one found a trail. I always hoped you'd made it. Maybe stayed hidden, maybe didn't want to come back. But I had to believe you lived. Your brother, Sam." She didn't cry, but Ruth did, a single tear. Then she said something Edith would never forget. "We don't have to hide anymore, Mama." It was such a small sentence, such a simple thing, but it hit harder than any blizzard, because for all the years, all the hunger, all the danger, they'd never thought of it that way, that maybe survival wasn't the only thing left, but freedom. The next day, the man, Jacob, returned. Edith stepped out before he could call again. He stared for a long time, then knelt. It wasn't until that moment that she believed he might really be her kin. He told her about the valley, about how Willow Creek had grown, about the road that now reached up through the pass, about cars and radios, and a world so changed it made her stomach twist. He didn't pressure her, didn't ask her to leave. He just gave her a map and said, "If you ever want to come down, this is how." Then he left. The children didn't ask her what she would do. They waited. A week passed, then 2, and still she sat by the ridge, holding that letter, staring into a horizon that hadn't changed in 20 years. Her heart ached, but not for the town, for the unknown. One night Abram sat beside her, quiet. Then softly he asked, "Do you miss it?" She nodded. "Sometimes I miss voices, bells, warm bread." "Then we can go," he said. It wasn't a question, but Edith didn't answer, because she wasn't sure if they could. Not yet. They were free, yes, but freedom, after so many years, came with its own kind of chains. She walked alone the next morning, packed a satchel, took the rifle, said nothing to the children. She needed to see the road with her own eyes. It was 4 miles east, up past the pass, and down the ravine where her husband had vanished. She found it, carved into the hillside, narrow, dust-covered, but real. A tire track ran along the side, faded but undeniable. She touched it like it might vanish. Then she turned back, climbed the same way she came. And when she reached the top, she saw something in the sky she hadn't seen in 20 years. Smoke, not hers. Another fire. Closer, too close. She ran. Edith didn't run like a woman in fear. She ran like a mother who knew what fire meant when it didn't come from her own chimney. The path back to the shelter cut through narrow switchbacks, the snow packed slick and brittle underfoot. She didn't feel the cold, didn't hear the ice snap or the branches whip at her coat. The only sound was the thud of her boots and her heart hammering a rhythm she hadn't known in years. By the time she crested the ridge and dropped into the hollow where the children waited, her lungs were heaving and her fingers raw from gripping frozen bark. The smoke was thicker now, curling in lazy grey fingers across the canopy. It wasn't rising from their shelter. That much she saw immediately. But it wasn't far, maybe half a mile west, downstream, near the bend where the elk sometimes came to drink in spring. Abram was outside, standing like a statue, his long frame rigid, jaw clenched. Ruth crouched near the snow stove, clutching the knife that never left her belt. She had already packed their emergency bag, the rolled hide of supplies they could carry in 5 minutes if they had to vanish. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Edith motioned for silence, already circling the shelter, sniffing the wind. Whoever it was hadn't blundered in like Jacob had. There were no shouts, no careless trail prints, just fire, controlled, calculated. She left Abram behind to guard Ruth and crept toward the smoke, hugging the pines like they were old friends. Her rifle was slung tight across her shoulder, but it was the knife in her sleeve she trusted more. Guns jammed. Guns drew attention. A blade could whisper, and in the mountains, whispers kept you alive. The closer she got, the more certain she became. This fire wasn't accidental. Then she saw them. 3 figures, all men. One was tending the fire. Another sat cross-legged, sharpening something. The third paced, a shotgun in hand, eyes scanning the tree line. They had a mule, gear bags, a small tent, not trappers, not hikers. She'd seen their kind before, long ago, before the children could walk. Men who didn't belong anywhere, who found the edges of maps and filled them with malice. She couldn't hear their words, but she knew their kind of silence, the kind that hung in the air like a noose. She retreated, fast but quiet, tracing a wide arc back to the shelter, mind already racing. They had a day at most, maybe less, and they'd survived 17 winters not because they were stronger than the mountains, but because they never waited to be swallowed. Back at the shelter, she laid out the options. "We leave," she said. "Tonight." Ruth nodded, already retying the hide roll. Abram frowned. "Where?" Edith hesitated. "South, toward the road." It was the first time she'd said it aloud. The first time she admitted that the world outside the mountain might hold something more than danger. They moved in silence. The emergency kit was already packed. Dried meat, fishing hooks, a flint box, Ruth's sewing needles, extra moccasins, pine salve, and the last of the coffee from Jacob's bundle. Edith added the letter from her brother, folded tight against her chest. They doused the stove, kicked fresh snow over the coals, took down the tarp that camouflaged the shelter, and scattered the branches across a new spot, a decoy to buy time. Then they walked. Night fell hard, the kind of night that pressed against your bones. Edith led, her steps sure even in the dark, ears tuned to every crack and groan of the forest. Ruth followed, then Abram at the rear, watching the trail behind them, knife drawn. By dawn they had made it past the creek bend, through the boulder field and up the far ridge where the sky opened just enough to glimpse the lower world. From here, the road was 2 days south, maybe less, but they would have to cross Devil's Hollow, a narrow gulch flanked by sheer rock and prone to snowslides. It was the only way through without circling back toward the men. Edith didn't like it, but she liked the alternative less. They rested for 2 hours in the crook of a fallen cedar, eating dried roots and snow. Ruth slept with her head on Abram's shoulder. He stared into the trees like he was trying to see what his mother didn't say. "Why now?" he asked finally. "Why didn't we leave before?" Edith looked at him. "Because we didn't have anywhere to go. And now we do?" She didn't answer, just stood and motioned to keep moving. They entered Devil's Hollow by mid-afternoon. The sky had turned a hard gray, the kind that warned of more than cold. The wind hissed through the rocks like something alive. The pass narrowed, each step echoing off the stone walls. Edith moved slower now, each bootfall deliberate. Snow above could come loose with a whisper. They made it halfway when Abram stopped suddenly. He held up a hand, listened, then pointed. Voices behind them. The men had found their trail. They ran, not recklessly, just fast enough to gain ground. But the walls of the gulch acted like a horn, amplifying every breath, every slip. Edith's lungs burned. Ruth stumbled once, caught herself. Abram took the pack from her without a word, slinging it over his shoulder. The exit was in sight when the sound came. Not a voice, a crack, sharp, the unmistakable groan of snow moving above. "Down!" Edith shouted. They dropped, just as the hillside exploded. A white wall thundered down the slope, a slow-motion monster of ice and weight, and silence turned violence. Edith covered Ruth with her body. Teeth clenched, arms locked tight. Snow slammed into them, hard then harder, until she couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Then stillness. She opened her eyes, dark, but not death, just snow. She thrashed, slow, deliberate, feeling for air, for light. Then a hand grabbed hers, pulled. Abram. He dragged her upward until daylight stabbed her eyes. She gasped, coughing, blinking. "Ruth!" she croaked. There, a few feet away, her daughter, dazed, covered in white, but alive. They were half-buried, battered, bruised, but not dead. It passed. She stood slowly, brushed her palms on her coat, and walked outside. It was snowing, light, gentle. Abram stood near the pump, watching her. "Still want to go back?" he asked. She didn't reply, but something in her eyes told him she didn't know anymore. Spring came early that year. Jacob offered to take them down to Willow Creek, said there were places they could stay, people who could help, doctors, a school if the kids wanted it. Ruth had stared at him like he was insane. A school? Jacob laughed. It's like a long trap line, but with books. Abram didn't laugh. He was quiet, always had been, but now his silence felt different, like a rope pulled tight and held. Edith said nothing for a long time. Then, one morning, she told Jacob they'd go with him. He loaded the truck with care, tied down the hide roll Edith still refused to part with, and packed sandwiches in wax paper like it was a normal outing. Edith sat in the passenger seat, stiff as stone, while the children climbed into the bed of the truck like they were boarding a ship for a distant shore. The drive took 3 hours, down switchbacks, through thinning trees, past clearings that looked unnatural in their openness. Edith kept expecting the road to vanish, for some trick of the earth to close behind them and make this whole thing impossible. But it didn't. Willow Creek was not what she remembered. It had grown. Not a city, not even a town. Not really, but bigger. Paved streets, a church with electric lights, a store with glass windows, and crates of produce. She stared at an orange like it was made of gold. People stared at her too. She could feel it. Not just at her, but at the children, at their clothes, their boots, the way they moved. They weren't like the others. They didn't speak unless spoken to. They didn't know how to say please or thank you in that quick, casual way townsfolk did. They looked at everything too long. The local school teacher, a kindly woman named Mrs. Bell, offered to test Ruth and Abram for placement. Edith said no. But later, in private, Ruth asked, "Could I learn to read better?" And Edith's heart twisted. They stayed at a small cabin on the edge of town. A widow had passed and left it to the church, and Jacob arranged for them to stay there in exchange for chores. Ruth swept the floor every morning. Abram chopped wood for the preacher. Edith tended a garden that had long gone to seed. At night they sat on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the stars. It was quieter in town than she remembered. Not the deep, watchful silence of the mountains, but stillness nonetheless, a gentler kind, like people here had no reason to raise their voices. The townsfolk whispered. Of course, you could feel it in the way they paused when she walked by, in the way they asked 2 careful questions. "They say you lived up in the wilds for 20 years. I heard you fought off a bear with just a stick. Is it true you ate tree bark to survive?" She never answered. But one man, a storekeeper named Glenn, said something that stuck. "You didn't come down 'cause you couldn't survive," he said. "You came down 'cause you finally could." She nodded once. He didn't press. But peace didn't last. It never did. It was late summer when the letter arrived. From Jacob's friend in the ranger station. A report of 3 men, found dead near the edge of Devil's Hollow. Snow had melted by then, revealing their bodies, crushed, frozen. One had a shotgun still in hand. Jacob told her over coffee, voice soft. "We think they were the ones." She said nothing for a long time. Then, "The mountain took them." He nodded. "You didn't?" "No." He didn't ask whether she would have. She didn't say. By autumn, Ruth was reading aloud every night. Abram had taken a job helping an old farmer with fence repair. Edith started baking, bread mostly, simple things. Her hands shook the first time she kneaded the dough, not from age or fear, but memory. She hadn't made anything with flour in 2 decades. The smell filled the cabin. She cried again. This time, she let the children see it. The first snow came early. Edith stood outside, watching it fall. Ruth came up beside her, now wearing a shawl Mrs. Bell had made for her birthday. "You think we'll ever go back?" she asked. Edith didn't answer right away. Then, "We didn't leave the mountain. We brought it with us." Ruth didn't understand. Not yet, but someday she would. Inside, Abram lit the stove, not with flint and moss, but with a match. The flame caught, warm, controlled, no smoke, no hiding, just heat, real, lasting heat. The second winter came harder than the first, not the weather. That was mild compared to what Edith had known. There were flurries in early December, then a deep freeze that cracked the surface of the wells and slicked the town's few roads with rime. But there were no storms that swallowed buildings, no blizzards that turned the trees to ghosts. The town had salt and sledges and wood aplenty. Even the poor families had walls thick enough to hold in warmth. It wasn't the snow that pressed on her chest this time. It was the stillness of safety. Edith had survived 20 winters, where movement was survival, where sleeping too long could kill you, where forgetting to check the stove could mean waking up next to a child gone stiff and silent. Now she found herself awake at 3 a.m., not from hunger or fear, but habit. She'd sit on the edge of her bed in the dark, listening, and the quiet would scream at her. Not the silence of snow, but the blankness of peace. No frost inside the windows. No wood creaking under snow load. No cough from a sick child. Just nothing. One morning, after another night of pacing the floor barefoot, she opened the front door and stepped out into the frost. The stars above were hard and bright, uncaring. That had never changed. Whether she lived under tarps or shingles, the sky had always looked the same. Only now, the ground beneath her was paved with porch boards and church-taught manners. Behind her lay a stove with a steady flame, a pantry with flour in it, a daughter who slept with her arms curled around a stuffed cloth doll someone had gifted her in spring. Edith stood still in that doorway for nearly an hour. The cold bit her cheeks. It was a welcome pain. She didn't know who she was in this place. Not yet, but she was starting to find out. In town, people had stopped whispering. The Marlowe woman was no longer a curiosity. She was just Edith, the tall one with hard eyes who sold bread in the square and didn't barter on price. The one who taught the baker's son how to track a rabbit and scolded the butcher for hanging his smoked cuts too close to the sun. The one whose boy was stronger than any 3 ranch hands put together, who fixed fences like they were made of straw. The one whose daughter read books like she was starving. They called her Mrs. Marlowe, out of habit, but no one asked about the husband anymore. They all had their guesses. She let them keep them. She found work mending roofs, sewing hides into gloves for ranchers who couldn't afford store-made ones. Sometimes she just walked the tree line at the edge of town, for no other reason than the ache in her legs when she didn't. But she never walked toward the mountains, not once. It was the church bell that undid her, not the sight of it, not the weight, not the steeple, or the sound of children inside on Sundays. Just the bell. The first time she heard it ring, it was nothing. The second time, it reached into her chest and cracked something open. She sat down in the street and didn't move for 5 full minutes. People passed her, concerned but uncertain. No one touched her. She liked that about Willow Creek. They'd grown used to her. They knew what kind of woman she was. They let her be. That night, she took Ruth down the road past the fields. They sat on the stump of an old cedar, the same one where her great-grandfather's house once stood, long before roads, long before towns. The moon was sharp, the frost on the fields lit like crushed glass. "You're thinking about the mountains?" Ruth said. Edith smiled, faint. "Always. I miss it sometimes. So do I. I don't think I'd survive it now." "You would. You already did." They didn't speak after that. They didn't need to. In the spring, letters came, real ones, addressed with stamps and postmarks. A historian from Helena had heard whispers about the mountain widow. He wanted an interview. He offered money, publication, a book maybe. She burned the letter without reading past the second line. Then came another, from a school, a university in Missoula. They asked if she would come speak. Not about herself, they said. About survival, about self-reliance, about how people used to live. She didn't respond. Jacob tried to convince her. He was kind about it, always was. But he didn't understand. He never could. He'd grown up with fences, with railroads, with locks on doors, not because they were necessary, but because they were expected. He never lived where wolves could sniff your breath through the wall. Edith didn't hold it against him, but she couldn't give them what they wanted. They wanted a story, a neat arc, a woman in the wild who found her way back. But she had never been lost. Not really. She just hadn't needed anyone, until she did. In late summer, Ruth was offered a scholarship, full tuition, books, room, board. She brought the letter to Edith in both hands like it was something fragile. "I want to go," she said, "but I don't want to leave you." Edith read the letter twice, slowly. Then she folded it and said, "You go. You learn everything you can." Ruth's eyes filled. "What if you need me?" Edith looked out the window, toward the edge of the town where the trees still waited. "I'll be fine. I've already lived 100 lives." Ruth left in September. Abram stayed. He was building something out of lumber and nails and rough-cut beams. A cabin, not like the ones in town. He built it out beyond the last property line, just shy of the tree line. Not in the mountains, but close enough to hear them when they called. He didn't talk much about why. He didn't need to. Edith helped him notch the joints. She still remembered the way they were supposed to fit, tight and clean. She taught him to pack the chinking with ash and fur, how to build a firebox that would hold heat all night, how to cut a stovepipe through snow without letting in the cold. By the time the first frost came, it was finished. He didn't move into it, not yet, but he sat on the porch some nights, watching the woods. She sat with him. They didn't talk, they just breathed. And when spring came again, Edith baked bread for the whole town, set it out on a table near the square, didn't charge a cent. They called it a celebration. She called it forgiveness. Not for them, for herself. On the 20th anniversary of her husband's death, she walked into the mountains one last time, just to the ridge, just far enough to see the trees the way she remembered them, tall and eternal and uncaring. She stood there until the wind came. It spoke in the voice she knew, not in words, in warning, in welcome, in memory. She touched the ground with her fingers, pressed her palm into the moss, then rose and turned back. She didn't belong there anymore, but it would always belong to her. Back in town, the bell rang, and this time she didn't flinch. She smiled and walked toward the sound, toward life, toward the noise, toward the world she had survived to return to, not as a fugitive, not as a creature, not as a myth, but as a woman, a mother, a name they would remember.